The alarm clock pierced the silence of the bedroom at exactly 5:30 a.m. Eliza Montgomery's eyes opened instantly, her hand reaching to silence it before it could wake the sleeping form beside her. She slid out of bed with practiced ease, her feet finding her slippers in the darkness. The November chill had settled into their suburban Boston home overnight, and she pulled her robe tighter as she made her way to the kitchen. By 6 a.m., the coffee was brewing, lunches were packed, and Eliza was reviewing presentation notes for her morning meeting. At 6:30, she gently woke their 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, helping her select an outfit and brushing her long brown hair while quizzing her on multiplication tables. Only after Sophie was seated at the kitchen island, happily munching on whole grain waffles, did Eliza return to the bedroom to wake her husband, Richard. "Richard, it's almost 7, she said softly, placing a mug of coffee on his nightstand. The familiar scent of his expensive cologne still clung to his pillow, mixed with something else of perfume that wasn't hers. Eliza paused, her fingers lingering on the edge of the duvet, before she pulled it back slightly. "Your breakfast is ready," Richard grunted, turning away from her touch. "I told you I have a breakfast meeting today. Stop trying to micromanage me." Eliza's hand retreated. "Of course, I'm sorry. I forgot." She hadn't forgotten. He'd mentioned no such meeting. But after 15 years of marriage, she'd learned which battles were worth fighting. "Sophie's ready for school. I've laid out your blue suit. You have the Peterson presentation today." She moved toward the door, pausing only when she heard his voice again. "I don't need you to pick out my clothes, Eliza. I'm not Sophie." His voice carried that edge, the one that had grown sharper over the past 2 years. "And tell Sophie to keep it down. Her voice carries through the whole house." Through the cracked door, Eliza could see Sophie at the kitchen island, quietly reading a book while she ate. The child hadn't uttered a word all morning. By 7:45 a.m., Eliza had dropped Sophie at school with a kiss and a reminder about her piano lesson after school. By 8:15, she was pulling into the parking garage of Montgomery Financial Group, the investment firm where Richard served as CEO. She parked in the far corner, away from the reserved executive spaces, and took the service elevator to the 30th floor. As director of special projects, Eliza occupied a small office in the east wing of the building, away from the main executive suites. The position had been created for her 3 years ago, after she'd expressed interest in returning to work once Sophie started kindergarten. Before their marriage, Eliza had been a rising star at Blackwell Capital, with an MBA from Wharton and a reputation for turning around struggling portfolios. But Richard had insisted she stay home after Sophie was born, and by the time she returned to the workforce, her former contacts had moved on, her skills deemed outdated. "Good morning, Mrs. Montgomery," said Jenna, the department assistant, as Eliza made her way to her office. "The quarterly reports are on your desk, and Mr. Foster called to confirm your lunch meeting." "Thank you, Jenna." Eliza smiled, setting down her bag. Her office was utilitarian, no windows, minimal decoration, but it was hers. A framed photo of Sophie at the beach last summer was her only personal touch. "And please, how many times do I have to ask you to call me Eliza?" "Sorry, Eliza," Jenna smiled. "Oh, and Mr. Montgomery's assistant called. The executive committee meeting has been moved up to 10 a.m., and he's requested your attendance." Eliza's fingers paused over her keyboard. Richard had never invited her to an executive committee meeting before. In fact, he'd been explicit about keeping their professional lives separate. "Did she say why?" "Something about the Harrison portfolio review," Jenna replied. "You've been working on that project, right?" Indeed she had. For 6 months, Eliza had been conducting a comprehensive analysis of the Harrison Group's investments, one of Montgomery Financial's largest clients. She'd identified several inefficiencies and had prepared recommendations that could potentially increase returns by 15%. She'd submitted her report to Richard weeks ago, but had heard nothing back. Until now. At 9:55 a.m., Eliza entered the executive boardroom, portfolio documents in hand. The long mahogany table gleamed under recessed lighting, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Boston Harbor. Several board members were already seated, including James Wilson, the firm's COO and Richard's closest friend since college. "Eliza, what a surprise," James said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We don't often see you up here in the clouds." "James," Eliza nodded, taking a seat at the far end of the table. "Richard asked me to join today." "Yes, he mentioned something about the Harrison Review." James glanced at his watch. "Though I must say, your analysis seemed rather ambitious. Perhaps overreaching." Before Eliza could respond, the room fell silent as Richard entered, followed by Victoria Bowman, the firm's newly appointed chief investment officer. Victoria was everything Eliza was not: tall, impeccably styled with designer clothes, confident to the point of aggression. At 35, she was already featured in Forbes' 40 Under 40 list and had been personally recruited by Richard from a competing firm 6 months ago. "Thank you all for adjusting your schedules," Richard began, taking his position at the head of the table. His eyes skimmed past Eliza without acknowledgement. "I've called this meeting to discuss an exciting new direction for the Harrison portfolio." For the next 20 minutes, Richard and Victoria presented a strategy for the Harrison investments, one that incorporated many of Eliza's recommendations without any attribution. As slides displaying her research appeared on the screen, Eliza felt her chest tighten. She had spent countless nights working on that analysis, often after Sophie was asleep, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning. "If there are no questions," Richard concluded, "we'll implement these changes immediately. Victoria will oversee the transition." "Actually," Eliza said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I do have a question." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Richard's jaw visibly tightened. "The analysis you've presented," she continued, "bears a remarkable resemblance to the report I submitted last month. I'm curious why my contribution hasn't been acknowledged." Victoria laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Richard mentioned you'd compiled some preliminary data. We used it as a starting point, certainly, but the strategic recommendations are entirely original." "Original?" Eliza opened her portfolio, extracting a document. "Even the projection models on slides 7 through 12? Because they're identical to the ones I created. Down to the decimal points." Richard cleared his throat. "Eliza, this isn't the time or place to discuss who deserves credit. The important thing is that the Harrison Group receives the best possible service." "Of course," Eliza replied, gathering her documents. "I just thought transparency was one of our company values." "Isn't that what the plaque in the lobby says?" She could feel Richard's anger from across the room, but something had shifted inside her. After years of shrinking herself, her voice, her ambitions, her presence, something had finally broken through. "If there's nothing else," Richard said tersely, "you're all dismissed." "Except you, Eliza. I'd like a word." As the other executives filed out, Eliza remained seated, her hands folded calmly on the portfolio in front of her. James Wilson was the last to leave, throwing a sympathetic glance her way before closing the door. "What the hell was that?" Richard hissed, once they were alone. "You embarrassed me in front of the entire executive team." "I simply asked for recognition of my work," Eliza replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Work that you and Victoria presented as your own." "Your work?" Richard laughed, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Let's be clear, Eliza. You have a position here because you're my wife. Your Director of Special Projects title is a courtesy, a way to keep you occupied. The real work, the important decisions, those are made by professionals like Victoria." Each word landed like a physical blow. I was a professional before I met you, Richard. I gave up my career to raise our daughter because that's what we agreed was best for our family. And you've been a burden ever since, he snapped, the words seemingly escaping before he could stop them. A financial burden, an emotional burden. Do you have any idea how hard I work to maintain our lifestyle? To pay for Sophie's private school, the house in Beacon Hill, the summer home in Cape Cod? And all I ask in return is that you don't interfere with my business. Eliza stood, gathering her portfolio. Is that all you wanted to say to me? Richard ran a hand through his hair, his wedding ring catching the light, the ring she'd placed on his finger 15 years ago, promising forever. Go back to your office, Eliza. And next time, remember your place in this company. The remainder of the day passed in a blur. Eliza canceled her lunch meeting, unable to stomach the thought of food or conversation. At 2:30 p.m., she received a text from Richard's assistant. Mr. Montgomery will be working late tonight. Don't wait up. By 3:15 p.m., Eliza was in her car, driving to pick up Sophie from school. As she waited in the carpool line, her phone rang, an unfamiliar number with a New York area code. Mrs. Montgomery? This is Andrew Foster from Blackwell Capital. Mr. Foster, Eliza replied, surprised. Andrew Foster had been a junior analyst when she worked at Blackwell 15 years ago. What can I do for you? I'm calling to follow up on our conversation from last week, he said, about the potential acquisition. Eliza glanced around, making sure no one could overhear. Yes, of course. I apologize for the delayed response. Things have been complicated. I understand completely. These matters often are. His voice was professional but kind. I've reviewed the documents you sent over. Your silent ownership of 51% of Montgomery Financial shares puts you in an extremely advantageous position. Blackwell is prepared to make a formal offer whenever you're ready to proceed. Thank you, Mr. Foster. I need a little more time to consider my options. Through the car window, Eliza could see Sophie emerging from the school building, her small face lighting up at the sight of her mother's car. I'll be in touch by the end of the week. After hanging up, Eliza took a deep breath, centered herself, and smiled as Sophie climbed into the car, chattering about her day and her upcoming piano recital. For Sophie's sake, she maintained the facade of normalcy, pushing aside the weight of Richard's words and the decisions that loomed before her. Later that evening, after Sophie was asleep, Eliza sat at her home office desk, surrounded by financial documents and legal papers. The story they told was one Richard had no knowledge of, couldn't have, given how little attention he paid to her activities outside of serving his needs. When they'd first married, Richard had been a promising investment banker with big dreams but limited capital. Eliza, whose parents had left her a substantial inheritance, had believed in those dreams. She had quietly invested in his fledgling company, becoming the majority shareholder through a series of holding companies and trusts managed by her former mentor at Blackwell. It had been her way of supporting him while maintaining her own financial independence, a security measure her father had advised before his death. Over the years, as Richard's ego grew alongside his public profile, Eliza had kept her ownership secret. It was easier that way, allowing Richard to believe he'd built his empire alone while she focused on raising their daughter. But now, with Sophie growing more independent and Richard's behavior becoming increasingly demeaning, the time for secrets had passed. The following morning, Eliza dropped Sophie at school and arrived at the office earlier than usual. By 8:30 a.m., she was seated in a conference room with Andrew Foster and two attorneys from Blackwell Capital. Are you certain about this, Mrs. Montgomery? Andrew asked, sliding the final document across the table. Once you sign, there's no going back. Eliza's pen hovered over the signature line. I've been married to Richard for 15 years, Mr. Foster. I've supported his career, raised our child, maintained our home, and endured his growing contempt. Yesterday, he called me a burden. She signed her name with a steady hand. I think it's time he learned exactly what I've been carrying all these years. By 10 a.m., the paperwork was finalized. Blackwell Capital had acquired Montgomery Financial Group, with Eliza retaining a significant ownership stake and a position on the board of directors. The press release would go out at noon, just as the executive committee gathered for their weekly lunch meeting. At 11:55 a.m., Eliza entered the executive dining room on the 32nd floor. Richard was already seated at the head of the table, deep in conversation with Victoria. He looked up as Eliza approached, irritation flashing across his face. "Eliza, we're in the middle of a meeting. Whatever it is can wait until we get home." "Actually, Richard, it can't." She placed a sealed envelope in front of him. "This concerns everyone at this table." James Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Eliza, perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue." "I disagree, James," she replied, taking an empty seat across from Richard. "I think this is exactly where this conversation should happen." Richard tore open the envelope, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion as he scanned the documents inside. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" "It's a press release announcing Blackwell Capital's acquisition of Montgomery Financial Group," Eliza said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Effective immediately, all major decisions will require board approval, a board that I now sit on." Victoria laughed nervously. "That's impossible. Richard owns the controlling interest in this company." "No," Eliza corrected gently. "I do. Or rather, I did until this morning. I've owned 51% of Montgomery Financial since its founding 15 years ago." The color drained from Richard's face as he continued reading. "This can't be legal. You've been planning this behind my back. The same way you plan to present my work as your own? The same way you've been planning weekend business trips with Victoria for the past 6 months. Eliza's voice remained calm, almost compassionate. "We all have our secrets, Richard." As if on cue, phones around the table began to buzz and chime as the press release hit the newswires. Richard's phone lit up with his assistant's name, then the board chair's, then multiple other incoming calls. "You'll destroy everything I've built," Richard said, his voice breaking. "Is that what you want?" "You didn't build it alone, Richard. That's what you never understood." Eliza stood, smoothing her skirt. "The transition team from Blackwell will be arriving this afternoon. I suggest you cooperate fully. It will make things easier for everyone, especially Sophie." As she walked toward the door, Richard called after her, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "Where are you going?" Eliza paused, turning back to face the room of shocked executives. "To pick up our daughter from school. Today is her piano recital, remember? She's been practicing for weeks." She checked her watch. "I don't want to be late. Being present for the people who matter, that's never been a burden for me." 6 months later, Eliza sat on the deck of a beach house in Cape Cod, watching as Sophie built an elaborate sand castle near the water's edge. The divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, with Richard agreeing to generous terms once he realized the extent of Eliza's financial leverage. He had resigned from Montgomery Financial, now Blackwell Montgomery Group, and had taken a position with a smaller firm in Chicago. "Is this seat taken?" a voice asked, breaking into her thoughts. Eliza looked up to find Andrew Foster standing beside her, 2 glasses of lemonade in hand. Over the past months, as they'd worked together on the company transition, their professional relationship had evolved into a friendship, one based on mutual respect and shared values. "It's all yours," she smiled, accepting the offered drink. "Sophie's been at that castle for hours. She says it needs to be perfect before the tide comes in." "Perfectionism runs in the family, I see," Andrew observed, settling into the adjacent chair. "The quarterly reports came in yesterday. Your strategic restructuring of the Harrison portfolio has increased returns by 18%, 3 points higher than your original projection." "And then, let's not talk business today," Eliza said, watching as Sophie carefully placed a shell atop one of the castle towers. Some things are more important. Andrew followed her gaze to the little girl on the beach. She seems to be adjusting well. Children are resilient, Eliza replied. More than we give them credit for. She misses her father, of course, but the scheduled visits are helping. And she seems to like her new school. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the distant crash of waves and Sophie's occasional humming as she worked on her creation. I received an interesting call yesterday, Andrew said finally. From Richard's new firm in Chicago. They're interested in a potential partnership. Eliza raised an eyebrow. And what did you tell them? That any proposal would need to go through the board, of course. He hesitated. Your name came up. Richard asked if you'd be involved in the decision. And I told him that as a board member, you'd have a vote. Just like everyone else. Andrew's hand found hers on the armrest between them. He seemed surprised by that. Said something about never fully appreciating your business acumen until it was too late. Eliza's gaze returned to Sophie, who had abandoned her castle and was now running along the shoreline, arms outstretched as if embracing the entire ocean. It's funny how clearly people can see you once you're no longer standing in their shadow. For what it's worth, Andrew said quietly, some of us could see you all along. The comment hung in the air between them, full of possibility but without pressure. Eliza squeezed his hand lightly before releasing it, a gesture of appreciation for what was offered and what might someday be accepted. Sophie, she called, rising from her chair. Lunch is ready, sweetheart. As her daughter raced up the beach toward them, sand clinging to her knees and sunlight in her hair, Eliza felt a sense of peace settle over her. The burden Richard had accused her of being had transformed into a strength she carried with pride, the strength to rebuild, to nurture what mattered, and to step fully into the light of her own making. A year later, the offices of Blackwell Montgomery Group hosted their annual holiday party in the same executive dining room where Eliza had revealed her ownership to Richard. Now transformed with twinkling lights and festive decorations, the space bore little resemblance to the arena of her past battles. Eliza, elegant in a simple black dress, moved through the crowd of employees and their families, stopping to chat with team members from all levels of the organization. As board director of employee development, she had spent the past year creating new pathways for advancement, with a particular focus on supporting parents returning to the workforce after raising children. Across the room, she spotted Victoria Bowman in conversation with a group of analysts. After the acquisition, Victoria had expected to be terminated, but Eliza had surprised everyone by offering her a lateral position instead. Talent is too valuable to discard over personal differences, she had told the board. Victoria had accepted with reluctant gratitude, and over time, a cautious professional respect had developed between the two women. Mom, can I have another cookie? Sophie appeared at Eliza's side, her holiday dress slightly rumpled from an impromptu dance session with the children of other employees. Just one more, Eliza smiled, smoothing her daughter's hair. We still have dinner with Grandma later, remember? As Sophie dashed off toward the dessert table, Eliza felt a familiar presence beside her. Andrew, handsome in a dark suit, offered her a glass of champagne. To new traditions, he said, clinking his glass against hers. And to letting go of burdens that were never ours to carry, she added, a smile touching her lips as she looked around at the company they had reshaped together. Later that evening, as snow began to fall over Boston, Eliza received a text message from Richard. Sophie left her recital music at my place last weekend. Should I mail it or bring it to her next visit? A small thing, this new consideration from the man who had once dismissed her contributions so completely. Not an apology that had come months earlier, stumbling and imperfect but sincere. Just a simple acknowledgement that they were still connected through their daughter and that this connection deserved respect. Next visit is fine, she replied. She's looking forward to seeing you." Setting her phone aside, Eliza joined Sophie and Andrew at the dining room table where they were setting up a board game, their laughter filling the warm apartment. The healing wasn't complete, perhaps it never would be, but the journey from wound to wisdom had given her something more valuable than vindication. It had given her back herself, stronger and more complete than before. And that, Eliza knew, was never a burden to carry.